Thank you very much thanks for the invitation. And it's really a pleasure to be here. Now, I was tasked with giving a more academic talk. So I'm going to present a paper that I'm working on right now. And I'm quite interested actually in the prior discussion that we had on 5G and I'm obviously interested in AI and new business models and things. But what I'm going to focus on today is a little paper that I have, which is under review. I'm very happy to get your feedback and comments, and actually you can stop me whenever you want and ask me questions, or if no one does that, then I'll just go through all the way to the bitter end. Okay? But very happy to get your feedback on this paper. So this is a paper with Gianvito Lanzola, who's at Cass Business School, and Danilo Pesce at the Politecnico di Torino. So we have been working on this for a year or so, and it's kind of a literature review paper and a conceptual paper. So any kind of conceptual lack of clarity, I'm happy to get your feedback here. So, so here's the motivation here, which is that digitalization seems to affect everything. So why not the innovation function itself? So that was the original idea that we had here. We're trying to understand how digitalization might give new possibilities and opportunities for innovation management, but that's something that people talk about a little bit and think about. But we also want to focus a little bit on some of the challenges and constraints too, because typically, of course, I'm guilty about this myself, is doing phenomenological research, and we always think, oh, this is great, people should do more. More is always better. And the same thing with crowdsourcing. We should always do. The more crowdsourcing you have, but then at some point someone says, well, wait a minute, is there no end to how much crowdsourcing you could do, et cetera. So same thing with the digital transformation, right? So we have tried to think a little bit about what are some of the pluses and minuses of doing digitalization and how that affects an innovation management function in a company. Okay, so I think I just said that, integrate some of the conflicting views, and we're focusing on search and recombination. And of course, I'm very interested in search and recombination. I think it's an interesting topic. And if you look at the number of articles, if you look at Journal of Product Innovation Management here, we found that there were 63 papers on the role of search and recombination in innovation and new product development. Just since in the last 10 years. And of course, if you just look at search and recombination, research policy has 88 articles in the title of search recombination, and all the other journals there too. So it's kind of an interesting topic. It's an interesting way of thinking about innovation. So this is why I chose that. Okay, so the first thing here is, I think this is preaching to the choir here, that digitalization does not equal digitization. Okay, digitization is purely the act of making something from analog into digital, and digitalization is some kind of combination of the digitization and the connectivity. Okay. So here what we're going to do is we're going to do a couple literature reviews. One is going to be antecedents of search and recombination, and the second one is going to be digitization and connectivity on the innovation function. They'll come up with a little framework in the end. Okay, so how did we do this? Basically, what we did is we did a kind of a literature review and an analysis of the literature. So starting with these different journals over here from different categories, and then we broke them into these two different topic areas that I just mentioned. And then we found roughly 600 articles, and here's the search that we actually use. So if search and recombination, search and knowledge, so blah, 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 blah. Okay, and then we ended up with specific focus. We ended up with 300 plus articles that we analyzed. And if we just look at some of the main topics here, so we have knowledge and organizational learning. That's obviously a big theme here for search and recombination. We have resources and capabilities, and then we have cognitive and socio-emotional costs. So what are some of the cognitive costs of search and recombination? For example, sharing. People may or may not be willing to share knowledge, for example. That could be an example of that. Okay, and if you look at the second one, which is digitization and connectivity, then we basically have here, there's the attributes. Changes in the attributes of organizational knowledge, and we also have the changing distribution of competencies in the innovation function. So that's actually a pretty nice theme that we've been that we thought about for this. So if we look at this, so I'm just trying to walk you through our little analysis here. So if you think about these things, there's kind of an intersection between those two topics, and one has to do with knowledge, and the second one has to do with competencies. There might be other ones too, which I talk about at the end. But these are the two main ones that we decided to take up here. Okay, so thinking about knowledge and competencies, and we basically describe this little space here where we have knowledge here on this one axis, and here we have competencies on the other axis. Okay, and so to think about this axis here, what we're saying is that you could have the case on this side where you allow, there's going to be, either way, there's going to be an increase in knowledge because if you're digitizing and if you have a digital transformation, you're going to increase the knowledge. But the question is, how much is that knowledge shared? How much is that knowledge moving across the boundaries, let's just say, of different organizational units? And so one of our arguments here is that, well, on the right-hand side here, it's going to unleash knowledge and new interactions between different groups of people. Okay. And on the left-hand side here, now actually I'm very open to suggestions of what we can call it. We called it crystallizing, but it's not very good. Referees didn't like it in the first round. So if you have any other ideas what we could call this. But basically we're thinking about some kind of like knowledge siloing effects. And some people have done some studies on this showing that sometimes if you have an increased digital transformation, that you might actually end up siloing knowledge, people sharing less across the interface. And they're more deep in their own areas, but then they're not talking as much. So that's the left side here. And if you look at the top versus the bottom of this thing, what we had is we were trying to understand the role of having replacing what we call legacy skills with digital skills. And so you probably heard like, oh, you should go out and hire hundreds of data scientists or something like this. It's an open question. Do you really want to do that? It's actually probably useful to have some. So I'm not saying you should have none, but sometimes you may be pushing out people that have specific context knowledge, and you're bringing in people that don't have that context knowledge, and instead you're bringing in people who have a lot of digital knowledge, which can be good, but maybe you also need some of the others. So that's the idea here. Okay, so let me just talk through these little 4 quadrants now in the short period of time we have left. Just to give you a couple little examples here. This first one, let's start with A here, where we have local search and digital, recombining and layering digital over the legacy, and kind of a peripheral innovation. And the people criticize Kodak a lot. Actually, they say, "Oh, Kodak, they missed the boat on digital cameras and things like this." Actually. I actually did a case study myself on this on the advanced photo system, which was an actual allowing metadata, of the film, so you could actually analyze and see where it is and tag it and things like this. So actually, they were actually one of the first companies to think about this, but somehow it wasn't a complete transformation of their offer, was it? It was like trying to tweak a component, a peripheral component, and adding a digital component to that, rather than anything else up here, which is fine. It's kind of an example. They also had this General Electric case where they had like a digital, GE digital, and they thought that it was going to be diffuse over the whole organization, but instead they ended up being more unto themselves. They didn't have a lot of the context knowledge of the specific areas of the other parts of GE. So it's tricky somehow, but it could be interesting for some kind of peripheral innovation. Then to move on, actually the point was well taken about the alphabet. Actually, this is really Alphabet, not Google, I should say. But what we talked about here was like kind of a digital skunkworks type operation, like setting up a digital, product off on its own. And the Google and the Alphabet has done this with the Google Labs and Google X and a few other little projects, which actually may or may not have been considered successful. You can, think about that yourselves. But it was an interesting idea, which is to set up a kind of a digital skunkworks separate from the company, set up some kind of new digital product, and make that separate from everything else that you've done. And I think that's one option here. So we call that a digital breakthrough innovation if it's successful. Then if you're down here, this is where I said people think they'll end up here, which is a digital business innovation. And a lot of companies thinking about this assume that this is going to be a very quick jump. And some of the talks this morning were actually about this, like it's, well, not so fast, you may not jump directly into this. But in any case, some interesting examples could have been like Netflix, from what I understand. I'm not a Netflix subscriber personally, but apparently they've been developing content that is also something that can be watched, specifically made for you watching on your phone, things like this. So there's a kind of a merger of, people call it the merger of the physical and the digital world somehow. Other examples could be some kind of connected cars, connected home systems, and things like this, where you might actually change the whole array of activities that are going into it, priming appliances before you get home, etc. Okay, so we're going to call that the digital business innovation. And finally over here is some kind of integration of digital and legacy. And this is incremental innovation, a core component. So we talked a little bit in the paper about like smartifying. Like you've probably heard of smart sneakers or smart watches. Like your tennis shoes have sensors in them, and then it gives you a little report about what you did that day. Or this cruise thing. This is this ocean cruise. There's an ocean medallion that when you go on a cruise and they give you the medallion, then it tracks you everywhere you're going. I mean, literally. But I mean, people like it because they analyze your movement on the ship and they propose you things that you can do, and they're basically analyzing everything you're doing. And so it's kind of this. Doesn't really change the basic thing, but it puts another digital component onto it that makes it more smart somehow. Okay. So let me wrap up a little bit here with this talk, which is implications for innovation management. I think that we're basically trying to make the point here is that it might lead to a self-reinforcing loop that has an impact on the innovation of the firm, and there could be experimentation might be useful. Focusing on sensors at the expense of improving the physical product, might increase the disconnect between the digital and physical realms. So, and on the other hand, overemphasis on physical risks making digital obsolete during that time period. So there's a lot of little trade-offs and stuff that we talk about in the paper here. Here's one of the contributions of this paper. Basically, we're trying to complement the purely positive, this purely positive spin on digital technology. Like, oh, it's great, we should just do more of this, we should have more digital ambassadors, we should hire more digital skills people. And just think about, well, okay, there might be some trade-offs here, even in an innovation management function inside a company. We're looking for, the idiosyncratic changes, and you can't just be dumped into the innovation function, which I think everyone here knows about that already. And we show how the digitization might influence the antecedents of search and recombination, and then we develop the predictions on the likely scope there. And then in terms of these, this is what I was saying before, you asked about the scalability here, and there's other things too. So, we also thought about this, and it came out in the literature review as well. There's also the formal and centralized governance mechanisms. I think this is actually really important. I think it's a super interesting topic. But three-dimensional graph, doesn't work very well in a paper. But personally, I feel like centralized governance could be very agile, because if you know what you're doing, you can move quickly. On the other hand, you could have some kind of like surveillance, surveillance function or something like this, which basically would not necessarily lead to better outcomes for innovation somehow tracking everything that everyone's doing. So I think that there's some centralized, decentralized decision making is also an interesting dimension here as well. And we could think about this governance, knowledge, competencies, digitalization could be good. And then we thought about this. What is the balance between digital and legacy skills? And that's another thing that we thought at first, like how can we manage this balance? But it's getting too complex for the one paper, empirical work. Then I'm just going to conclude here with a little talk because I'm moving to Imperial College London. I'm going to move in May. And I wanted to at least tell you a little bit about my new center, which I'm starting there in May, called the Center for Digital Transformation. And just to give you a little ideas here, so it's it's going to be pervasive. It's going to be the newest center of Imperial College, and we're going to look at the business and organizational implications of the digital revolution. So I think that's a very interesting topic for all of you. And and we'll probably work with companies as well, which I'm very keen on. I like working with companies. I think it's fun, so we'll probably try and have some kind of partners or some kind of sponsor organizations that work with us, on basically doing this insights, try and connect people with different Imperial professors, with research, different aspects of research, kind of things that I'm interested in. And networking, which is organizing events for people and organizing conferences and things like that. Let me stop there. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your comments.